there's a new book out. It's called Inevitable: Inside the Messy, Unstoppable Transition to Electric Vehicles. And I have been lucky enough to have an advanced reader's copy. And in my Welsh farm girl words, I bloody love it. And you will too. And joining me today is the author, none other than Mike Colias. Now, if you don't know Mike, and you probably do if you're in the auto industry, but if you don't, Mike is a Wall Street Journal reporter and veteran of the U.S. automotive beat. He is based in Detroit, and he's covered General Motors for 12 years, added Ford to his duties 5 years ago. And this book brings together facts, data, backstories, and insider information as he masterfully weaves together multiple sources, fact-checked several times, I might add, to bring us from the start of the EV to where we are today. All of the many twists and turns that we've taken in this industry as we try desperately hard to evolve from the world of ICE to BEV. I can think of no better time for this book to come into existence. So I'm thrilled to welcome to the show Mike Colias, author of Inevitable. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Jan. That was a very nice intro. And yeah, as you know, it's almost like, when do you put out a book on the EV transition? Because it's early days still, but it seems like there's already a ton that's happened. And so, I hope that the book kind of brings your audience up to speed on sort of how we got here and where it's going.
What I loved about it, Mike, is that it's a story. You're telling a story. So often the information that we get in our beloved auto industry is sound bites. It's articles. It's a little bit of this, and this happened here, and this happened there. But as far as I know, nobody has really sat down and threaded it all together. And I thought I was up to date on a lot of things going on in the auto industry, but there were some things in there that I didn't know. So it was great to just sit down and just immerse yourself in all of it. But what possessed you to do this?
Well, like you said, I've been covering the industry a long time, and I feel like in the last 6 or 7 years, this has been the story, right? It's been all EVs all the time. That's all any of the executives have wanted to talk about. That's all we in the media have wanted to write about. And I just could tell it's at a certain point, it became clear that, this is a disruption that's kind of even beyond generational. It's kind of a once in a century thing. And, this is the biggest disruption, I think, since transportation went from horses to cars more than a century ago. And so it just seemed like a moment, and given the gift I have of being able to cover it day to day, I knew that I was in a position to tell it and to meet the people that are sort of in and around this and making it happen. There's an orbit, like you talk about, this industry can get tied up in data and stats and figures and supply chain. But you and I know that there's a ton of interesting people that make all of that happen. And I was just in a position to be able to get a lot of these folks to tell their stories and the broader story of the arc of this transition that's really still, pretty early on.
Yeah, you're right. And it's the backstories. Everybody loves a backstory. And there's a ton of them in this book, and I loved every one of them. But let's start off and talk about Jim Farley. You talk about Farley quite a bit in your book, and I'm going to read a quote from your book, and it's right at the very beginning. In fact, I think it's the very first chapter. And you say, and I quote, "About a dozen Ford executives gathered inside a nearly empty warehouse on the Automakers campus in Dearborn, Michigan. They were there for an autopsy. It was early 2022. After a late start, Ford had loudly announced its arrival into the electric vehicle race. Its muscular Mustang Mach-E SUV was a relative hit. It was the top-selling U.S. electric model without Tesla in its name. The Lightning, a battery-powered version of the company's top-selling F-150 pickup truck, had a waiting list stretching more than 2 years and was being plugged by Jimmy Fallon. But Ford CEO Jim Farley was worried. Farley wanted to see this teardown of his own company's Mustang Mach-E right next to a teardown of a Tesla Model 3. It was an engineering reality check. And it most certainly was. Tell us what was going on there.
These kind of tear down dissections of a car, engineering departments in big companies, the car companies do this all the time, or, relatively frequently. I think what's unusual about this one was a CEO saying, okay, I really want to know what's going on here. I think at the time, like the setup suggested, there was a lot of enthusiasm over EVs. The companies were announcing their plans to pour. It had already started pouring tens of billions of dollars into this. Models were well underway. There were, like you said, waiting lists. I think what he was seeing was, okay, this is all great momentum, but I know we're losing money on this. And I know Tesla has started to make pretty nice profit margins on their EV business, which is obviously the leader in the world. And so he was trying to figure out, okay, what's the difference? And obviously Ford was just starting up at this point. So you do have to scale a business and you're probably going to be unprofitable for a certain period of time. But I think he just saw the writing on the wall that there's a big gap between the way we're engineering and building these cars and the way Tesla must be doing it, and probably the Chinese too. And so he wanted to know the truth of what was going on under the sheet metal. And I think that was a wake-up call for Ford and probably the engineers in the room. And he had overseeing this whole process a guy named Doug Field, who was sort of the godfather of the Model 3 at Tesla, who had just joined Ford months earlier. And so he was kind of the perfect guy to take this thing apart and show, look, we've got way more bolts and yards of wiring in here. That adds needless weight, that adds needless cost. And they just realized they have a long way to go to sort of engineer and design these EVs to get the cost out.
I think this is a perfect example of the complacency that exists in our legacy auto industry today. This event took place in 2022. We have known about Tesla for many years before 2022. And we scoffed as an industry, didn't we? And we laughed and we said, oh, they're just this tech company. They don't know how to make a car. We only know how to make a car. They're just a tech company. They don't know what they're doing. And then they figured it out. And then we said, oh, but they don't know how to scale. They'll never figure out how to scale. Only we know how to scale because we've been building cars for over 100 years. So they don't know how to scale. And they figured out how to scale. It wasn't easy, but they figured it out. So it's this level of complacency that exists that I think sometimes it just prevents us from moving forward. What do you think?
I agree with you. I think there was a lot of sort of eye rolling and a lot of people dismissed Tesla inside the industry over the years. I also think there were executives who took the threat seriously and just weren't able to break the inertia of these big organizations. I mean, there's another spot in the book where Jim Farley was in Europe and he was worried about Tesla, and that was 2017, 16 or 17. Mary Barra, to her credit, was early on, I think, realizing that this is the direction we need to move. And GM was one of the first big OEMs to declare in a big way, the future's electric, this is what we're going to do. Now, the execution we can talk about hasn't quite been there in a lot of aspects of that. So that it wasn't a complete dismissal of the threat. I just think that, GM's a great example, right? I mean, going all the way back to the EV1 in the 1990s and hydrogen fuel cells and the Chevy Volt and then the Bolt. I mean, it was like this dabbling in electrification. And I don't know that it was a conscious decision that, this program's not making money, so we're going to cut it. I mean, I think that happened, but I think there were plenty of people inside the company that probably believed today we could have been Tesla had we just followed through with this stuff. And I just think it's a tough thing. This is like the innovator's dilemma, right? Can you give up the thing that you've been so successful with for decades to grasp onto this other thing that's going to be painful in the short to medium term? We're not going to make money on it. And what's not our sweet spot. And companies just have a subconscious hesitancy to go all in. And I think Mary tried to get the company to go all in, and it's been hard.
Yeah, I think it comes back to culture. Our culture will not allow these innovative ideas to come to fruition. It just will not.
Industry culture.
Yes.
Yeah. And yes, that's a good point. It's not picking on General Motors or Ford or anybody. I think it's right. It's automotive writ large has been behind and is behind.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned GM, the iCar is a classic example with General Motors. And Lutz had a vehicle ready, debuted at the 2007 auto show. I think I was there, actually. Can't really remember. It was a few auto shows ago. But he had it, right? He knew it in his bones, and he had it. And the product that emerged, that came into production, was not exactly like the prototype, was it?
Oh, right. Yes. The iCar was the sort of prototype that became the Chevy Volt. And there were good reasons why I think they needed to change the design of the Volt, of the iCar that they had initially planned to be the Volt. It was this really sleek looking, beautiful car. And it wasn't very aerodynamic. And then, they couldn't figure out what platform it would go on. So it went on, the Volt went on the Chevy Cruze platform. It's all the things that happen inside of a giant automotive company when you're trying to figure out how to do something cost efficiently. And none of those decisions were bad ones. That they all made business sense at the time. But I think I point to that example in the book because at the same time you had Tesla, designing the Model S, right? And from scratch, and didn't have any of those constraints. Didn't have to figure out, okay, what platform are we going to put this on to really contain costs? And so the Chevy Volt comes out, and it was considered like this breakthrough product, right? GM got a lot of accolades for that. It had a very cult following fan base, but it wasn't what Tesla ended up doing, which was, hey, look at this electric car that can look like, a stunning car that you'd want to show your neighbor when you get it home from the showroom. It didn't have that it factor that Tesla was able to build its brand around and grow from there.
Yeah, I have two favorite quotes in your book. And one of them is in that exact section, talking about Lutz and this car coming out. And I quote, GM's product development machine had shoehorned it into the engineering-centric system that would maximize cost savings and efficiencies. And that system was one developed and refined over a century to make gas-powered cars. I mean, there it is. That's what's happening in legacy automotive today. We have our systems that work well for us in the past, but they do not work well for generating innovative ideas and putting an EV on the road, do they?
That's right. Yeah, that quote could have come out of like a Bob Lutz book, because kind of stuff drove Lutz crazy. But I think when faced with the reality of working inside the parameters you need to work in a big global automaker like that, you've got to sacrifice some stuff. And the design got sacrificed, and it didn't turn out to be a bad car. A lot of people thought they should have built on the success of that Volt. But yeah, to try to do a complete teardown, a company like that, I mean, are we going to do $1 billion on this model that is basically just kind of a science experiment at this point, and we don't really know the market for it? And that starting point is, let's figure out how to do this with the most cost-effective kind of lens on the program. And so you weren't going to be able to take the kind of liberties that a Tesla took. So it's not really any one person's fault that the Volt ended up looking kind of like an ordinary car. It was just kind of the reality of the way the place is set up. But that's why it's so hard, I think, this whole innovation, to innovate beyond what you are at your core. When you're a big organization and that inertia takes hold, it's difficult.
Yeah. And that's my whole message. We talk about transformation in this industry in terms of product and technology. We talk about being a smartphone on wheels. We talk about ICE to BEV all day long. But it is the culture. It is the how we work together, how we think, how we lead, that will determine our success. And that's something that doesn't get as much attention as I believe it should.
Yeah, it's funny just in hearing you talk about that. I know that we've seen cases where car companies try to, okay, we need to innovate in this one particular area. So we're going to break off this group and let them do their thing. This skunk works kind of idea. And Ford's been doing this with its next generation of EVs because it's had the same problems, right? They've had a few electric cars on the market, the Lightning pickup truck, the Mach-E. They've sold well for the EV market as it is today, but they know there's a lot of shortcomings there. It's not optimized. They're losing a ton of money, $5 billion last year on their EV program. So they're coming out with their second generation, and that's what they did. They created a skunk works team out in California of like 100 engineers, and they've been trying to sort of work outside of the Ford machine. But I think in talking to people about where it's at now, eventually you have to go back to the machine to get the thing, built and spec'd, and engineering, manufacturing stuff. It's just that part's been hard. Like, it sounds like they made a lot of progress in the skunk works. Marrying it back into the organization you're kind of facing a lot of those same constraints. So it's a universal problem in the auto industry. And when you need a clean sheet design to do these electric cars as optimized as possible, it's been hard for the legacy automakers.
Yeah, it most definitely has. I think maybe Scout will have a chance. I don't know how involved VW is with Scout, but it feels to me like they're totally separate. I know that for GM and Ford, most of my work and my life has been in the supply base. So with GM, when they developed GM Energy, and Ford, when they spun off with their Blue Oval, but they still use the same purchasing processes. It's like, what? I mean, you've got to completely rethink and reinvent your processes and start questioning, why are we doing this? Why are we not bringing suppliers in early? Why are we still going through and quoting the business after the design is done? All these things that were well-known processes. And at some point in time, that was the right thing to do, but it's not anymore. We have to completely rethink everything that we do. And I don't see us doing enough of that, Mike.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And you wonder, given what we know about the balance sheet on some of these EV programs. I mean, Ford, somewhat unfortunately for Ford's decision, I've talked to Jim Farley about this, and it's like he wanted to put pressure on the organization to make it public how much money the car company's losing on its EV operations. At the same time, it's sort of become the poster child. It's the easiest one to point to. Ford lost $5 billion last year on its EV program, but that's even after applying all of these efficiencies and using the same purchasing organization for the component. To try to see what that would look like from whole cloth inside a company like that, it's almost hard to imagine, right? Which I guess is probably why you get to these sort of separated out, carved out groups that they try to do to sort of rethink everything. It's just, I think it's hard when it's still tied to the mothership, right? And Scout's a good question. I don't know exactly what the setup is there, but I do know that they're trying to be very arm's length from the parent company.
Yeah, because if VW purchasing is involved in that, look out. That's going to be a problem. The other thought too with VW is with Rivian. Again, I'll be very interested to see how that culture takes hold, because clearly the Volkswagen culture and the Rivian culture couldn't be more different. I mean, they're completely opposite ends of the spectrum. So which culture will take hold? I get the sense that VW recognizes that and wants to be more innovative and maybe more of a Rivian type automaker, but will their roots in legacy auto, are they so strong that it will prevent them from doing that? I guess time will tell, right?
Yeah, and it's a good point. If you were able to marry those two things in a really effective way, right? Like the traditional OEM with all of the manufacturing prowess it brings in supply chain and purchasing and optimization of things, but then they know what they need, which is a cool brand and attention to customer detail and what all the stuff that Rivian's bringing to the table, right? That company's struggled to ramp up and is still loss making, and now they're hitting the same sort of EV demand headwinds as everyone else, but like it's a pure brand and it's got that cachet. I think that a lot of the OEMs wish they had for their EV brands, and the design of the trucks and some of the attention to detail that goes into, the user interface and all the tech that goes into it. And so Volkswagen knows it needs that stuff. Rivian definitely needs help, I think, on the sort of industrialization. Yeah. And so if you can do it the right way, right, and with two companies like that, there's other examples of startups and traditional OEMs trying to figure it out. And it does feel like maybe what it might take to kind of move past this messy part of the transition that we're in now.
Yeah. I interviewed Dr. Andy Palmer. Dr. Andy Palmer was the CEO of Aston Martin. They call him the godfather of the EV because he brought the Leaf into existence at Nissan. And he started life in a very traditional command and control environment in the British auto sector. And now he's definitely in the mobility space. But he had a very interesting comment. And he said, it's not one or the other. It's not like the California startup culture versus legacy auto culture. You as a leader get to determine what culture you want for your company. And you take what you like about this culture and this culture, but it has to be yours. And I thought, wow, you know what? He's absolutely right. There's no right or wrong here. But there is a culture that needs to support innovation, that needs to support the working world, because we know it is changing and evolving. It is a culture that needs to support attraction and retention of Gen Z and now Gen A coming up. But it's up to you as the leader of a car company or a supplier to determine what that is. And that, to me, that's going to be the leader that we need for the future. That's the leader that we need in Stellantis, because I don't want to tell you how happy I was. What?
We'll find out what happens with that vacancy. But yeah, it's been a rough stretch for that company. And I'm sure there's a lot riding on that CEO appointment, because there's some great brands there, right? Jeep and Ram and all the stuff in Europe. And you're talking a top 5 global automaker from volume. And they've stumbled here, and they're, I think most profitable market in North America. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see who gets appointed there. Yeah, I think it's easier to, and nothing about this is easy. Like corporate culture is one of the fuzziest, most ethereal, like how do you change a culture? I think it's easier to set a culture from the beginning,
Yes.
like Elon Musk was able to do, and RJ Scaringe at Rivian. Much harder to try to change one that's been in existence for a long time. And that's what Mary Barr has been up against for her entire long tenure. And she's made a big focus on that. And in that case, I think if nothing else, Mary has figured out how to make very fast and efficient strategic decisions. GM's done a lot under her tenure now. A lot of it hasn't worked out, but she's figured out a way to get the machine to make a decision and then follow that path. And I think there's been so many, from investing in Cruise, which kind of ended with a thud here recently, dissolved it back into the company. I think the progress they made there on autonomous driving is going to pay dividends at some point, but certainly not what they envisioned when they went down that particular path. EVs, like I said, she was one of the first to declare a full pivot to EVs. Now it seems like GM's kind of big, messy middle with everybody else, but she's been able to get GM, which has had, as you know, this reputation of just not being able to get out of its own way, to make some big bets. And along the way, she's been a very good operator. I mean, the company has been the most profitable consistently of the Detroit 3 during most of her tenure.
I agree. You mentioned brand, and it makes me think of NIO. I think most of us in the auto industry will be aware of NIO, maybe not general public, but certainly in the auto industry. So you got a Chinese brand, and I was watching some of the social media around NIO not too long ago, and it's like a cult following. I mean, when they launch a vehicle, not only is it a great vehicle, and then we'll talk about the whole battery swapping thing in a minute, but not only is it a great vehicle, but it's the branding and the way that, they have followers. They have real followers. I think 10,000 people attended some vehicle launch. Could you imagine that happening with GM or Ford? 10,000 people showing up. They would kill for that kind of brand loyalty. What is going on there, Mike?
Well, building an automotive brand is very hard work. Probably not as heavy a lift when it's brand new from scratch than trying to breathe new life into brands that had seen their heyday and now you're trying to come back, which a lot of the legacy automakers have been faced with. But a brand like NIO, it had at one point been compared to Tesla, right? In the early days, it was the Tesla killer, and it had its stumbles. It was close to bankruptcy, and it's had to be bailed out a few times over in China. But they started out with this $1.5 million supercar was their first model. That's just like pure marketing and sort of setting the brand, right? This is what you can expect from us. I got a window into the origin story of NIO. I talked to Jack Chang, who was one of the co-founders, worked at Ford for a long time, and then at Fiat Chrysler. And he was recruited kind of in the mid 2010s by William Lee, who was one of the founders of NIO. And he said, we want to start this car company. And Jack was really kind of skeptical of this. He's like, you guys don't know anything about cars. You know how much money this is going to take? And he eventually was convinced to do it. And it was interesting. Like I talked to quite a few people who were kind of had toiled inside of one of the Detroit 3 for, a few decades, and got in the last part of their career, they were able to jump to this amazing story unfolding in China and be a part of it. We could talk more about a few of those folks, but getting back to NIO, They hired a designer from BMW's lead designer, way back in 2014, I think it was. And so the cars, everyone kind of looks at 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you would have, when you hear the term a Chinese EV, you might think of a small little get around car, glorified golf cart kind of thing. And NIO was really one of the first to show that, like, no, these are going to be really stylish machines that we're building. And they've been able to leverage that along with their retail setup. Is they've got all of these like beautiful high-end showroom type coffee shop spa combos all over in big cities all over the world. And it's really, I think, helped to sort of build this aura around the brand that they've really seemed to nail.
Yeah. And I think this whole dealership model has got to be reviewed and revisited. I was thinking about my dealership experiences way back in 2000. I was working for Maytag. Actually, I did jump out of the auto industry for a short time. And I was in Des Moines, Iowa. And at the time, that was 25 years ago, right? So I walked into the dealership in jeans and a biker jacket because it was the weekend, or I wasn't working. And I was probably hungover because I partied like a rock star back then. Those days are long gone. And I was practically ignored because they looked at me and they thought, well, jeans and a biker jacket, there's no way she could afford a Lexus. It was a Lexus dealership. And I remember that. They've come a long way now. I don't think that would happen now. And I think about even my local VW dealer, and I do like VW product, but it's dumpy in there. It's not a place I want to spend time in. And it seems like NIO's got that figured out.
Well, certainly all of the EV startups from Tesla on down have maybe not all, but most have taken that route of direct to consumer. We don't need a middleman in between us and the consumer. I think that gives them a lot more control over things like, pricing and just the go-to-market strategy. But you are going to run, I think we're seeing some of this with Tesla. There's a great big Tesla showroom and service center right by my house that opened a year or two ago that looks a lot like a dealership. Mm-hmm. There's a need for, once you get to scale, you've got to have some place to service these cars, and you can't. In the early days of Tesla, right, you'd put it on a flatbed and you'd see it 2 weeks later, because I'm sure the Tesla service on it was pretty white glove, high end, but early Tesla owners had to put up with a lot to get their cars serviced. And once you get more into the mass market consumer, people aren't going to put up with that. So you need a place to service these cars. But I do think that what we've seen with a lot of the traditional OEMs as they've gotten into EVs, we've seen efforts to kind of carve the retail network out a bit and take more control over, Ford started to go down that path. I think the dealers revolted a bit and they've backed off some. I think Honda just came out and said that this EV that they're doing with Sony, they're going to do through a direct to consumer. Polestar, I believe the same thing. So a lot of people in the industry are looking at this as the OEMs thinking maybe this is a way through this transition that we can take some of the power back from the retail network. I think it's going to be hard because you've got franchise laws in place, very strong ones all over the country, and the dealers are a pretty powerful group. Yeah,
no, you're absolutely right. And you had mentioned with NIO that one of the co-founders came up through the traditional OEM system. I think, did you also mention in the book, was it CATL was the same thing? The battery company, wasn't there?
Yeah. A guy named Bob Gallion, who was chief engineer for the battery on the EV1 at GM and was kind of really highly regarded battery chemical engineer who rose through GM and then was at Delphi and then I believe Magna. He was in his 50s. He had like this very esteemed career working in the US, all in and around batteries, and was in China to give a talk on batteries at a conference. This is, I think, 2011, and was approached by the CEO of, it was ATL at the time, a company that made battery cells for small devices, right? Consumer electronics. And he was starting an EV battery company. And so we sort of courted Bob Gallion, and Bob decided, okay, even though I'm sort of like heading into the twilight of my career, I'm going to go try this. And he was, I think, employee number 2 at CATL, which is now the biggest battery company in the world. So yet another example of someone who toiled in electrification in the US just to not see anything really come to fruition, and then went over to China and things explode.
So we have the talent, Mike, in our legacy auto industry. We have to put them in a position where they can be successful, where they can innovate and be successful. It's here. I've often heard that, I think it was Ford had the idea, or somebody within Ford, I forget if it's Ford or GM, had the idea of Uber many, many years ago. So these ideas are there. They're in our legacy auto company. But, as you said in your book, we try to shoehorn them into the way that we know things should be done, and then it dies, or then it's too expensive. So there's so much work to be done as we move forward into this transformation into EVs. So my question for you is this. Your book is titled Inevitable. Is it inevitable, the transition to EVs? Some would question that, given the current administration. Is it indeed inevitable?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I believe it is. And when I say that's like an aggregate of all the people I talk to on a daily and weekly basis. And I don't know many people in the industry who don't think it is, who think this has just been this fad that we spent a lot of money on and now it's going to go away. And I guess if I had to boil down a few of the reasons why, I would point to China and Tesla. Let's just take those two things. China is now almost half of sales over there are either electric or plug-in hybrid. Here it's 10%. So we're seeing this very narrow view of how this is playing out globally. China now has a ton of excess capacity. They've got overcapacity, too many players. There's going to be a shakeout in China, but they are making, in many cases, really good EVs affordably. They have like a 25 to 30% cost advantage over the Western OEMs. And so what people in the industry are now worried about are these cars going into markets like Europe, which has already happened, like Mexico. There's more gas combustion engine cars being exported from China now because the consumers there want the EVs. And so the combustion stuff is kind of the excess. But eventually it's going to be more and more EVs. So if you're Mary Barra and you've got this kind of plateauing of EV demand, and it looks like, what if this doesn't really happen? You've got a decision to make. You can either lean into what you've been good at all along, which is they make a lot of money on big trucks and SUVs, Cadillac Escalades, or do you continue to lean into this EV transition, even though you're losing money on it? And I think at the end of the day, all of the traditional automakers have no choice, because sure, you can be protected by tariffs in the short to medium term, but Jim Farley has said this, other CEOs have said this as well. I don't want to be counting on the whims of government officials to protect me from competition. We're going to have to compete. And I think those global forces are probably the biggest thing. There's other reasons people love EVs. The people who drive them, they're quick, they're quiet. They feel like you're driving the future. Tesla has super high brand loyalty. That's for a reason. There's other reasons why. I think it's also EVs just fit with what the car companies want to do in terms of more digitization and monetizing the data that comes off the car, autonomous driving, assisted driving. You can do all that stuff in a gas car. It's easier to do in electric cars. And so there's just a lot of reasons why it's going to be ugly and painful for a while for a lot of these companies, but I think it's going to continue to move down that path.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think that we live a somewhat protected life in the US. We don't see the Chinese product here. So we don't feel the threat as much. And when you go to Europe, BYD is everywhere. Mexico, MG, Chinese owned. The product is everywhere and people love the product and they're buying it. We've talked about the Chinese OEMs as being an existential threat to this industry, and it truly is. But we feel protected. Again, I think sometimes that complacency creeps in because we don't see that product. So we're like, oh, well, how could it be that great? I'm sure it's okay. MG, classic British brand, right? I had an MG sports car when I was 17 and I loved it. And then the Chinese bought the brand and now produce, as a taxi driver told me in the UK last year, they call it a throwaway car They call it, it's known to be a cheap car, but it's a car that people like because it's affordable. It's like an SUV. And I went to Mexico last year, and they're everywhere. There's MG dealerships everywhere. People think that it's the British brand, and they think it's not the British brand, it's a Chinese OEM. And part of me worries that, will BYD come and buy Jeep and Ram? What if that happened? Would that be the same kind of thing? I mean, these are all what ifs, but these are things that are happening outside of the US. So could it happen here? Well, I don't know. I guess time will tell, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I do think there's going to be a lot more of that, mergers and acquisitions and partnerships and consolidation. But if you're one of the Detroit companies, I don't think you can just assume that consumers are eventually going to demand, if you've got these quality cars that are affordable, we've already got a big affordability problem, right, in the industry. I think the executives who I talk to realize that these tariffs aren't bulletproof. We've seen how government policy can change very quickly, especially in this country. And they're gearing up, even though it's really hard right now, to eventually compete with China. But they're several years behind. And I think that's what the next few years is going to be about, is how this market matures in the US and how the companies can go about shoring up some of these losses and actually getting to profitability, because obviously that's going to be the name of the game for the companies.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And yes, EVs are inevitable. And I highly recommend that everybody in the industry read this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Mike Colias, it has been a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you, Jan. I had a ton of fun talking about this, so I appreciate having me on.
And don't forget, we'll have a link to the book in the show notes.